And good evening, my friends. Good evening. It's Monday. It is time for the writing kind of fantasy, science fiction, shenanigans, and general waffle stream. I don't think we're yet the number one shenanigans, general waffle, and sci-fi and fantasy stream on the internet, but that is an accolade that I think we should work towards, don't you? We'll see how we get there. Yes, it's Route 66. Yes, I've got my American badge on. I got this when I went to the States a few years ago. Back in the dim and distant days when we were still allowed to travel to places, I went to America for the first time in a long time in 2017, and I went out there to see the eclipse. And as you do when you're an Englishman in New York, I'm not an Englishman anyway. I'm a Britishman, but that's not a phrase. A British person overseas travelling through the United States. I hired a Mustang convertible because that was obviously the most low-key car I could get my hands upon. and drove around in the United States, and had all sorts of adventures. But there we are. Never mind. So anyway, lovely, fantastic. Everyone's waffling on. Excellent. Waffling shall ensue. Thank you very much. Well, lovely to see so many familiar names on the chat already. That's brilliant. Awesome. Good to see you. So the US has had their daylight saving. Why come you guys do it so early? I don't even know when ours is. What is the point? I mean, okay, daylight savings time. This is enough. I feel I can rant about daylight savings time. Well, what is the point of daylight savings times in the modern era? Okay, it's like I never really understood it. I mean, is it something to do with extra working light for certain professions or something? I mean, I've never really researched daylight saving time. It seems like a completely balmy notion to me. Let's move the clocks because clocks are an arbitrary thing anyway, right? What? JR19. Goodness me! Commander JR1988. You can't just jump in with serious questions at the beginning of the stream, my friend. You're gonna have to it's already disappearing off the chat. You're going to have to come back to me when things calm down, all right? So hold your question. We'll come back to you, my friend. We'll come back to you. Resender's raiding with a party of one. These raids, I must admit, I haven't done a raid yet. I must do a raid at some point. I just haven't got round to doing it. I always got this impression in my head of these people charging over the hill going, "Rah!" like a raid, which I suppose is where it comes from. But the idea of somebody charging over the hill with a party of one, guys, where are you? Anyway, it's lovely to see you, Resenda. Thank you very much for the raid. I do appreciate it. So a sort of raid of 50 or 60 people, that sort of makes sense to me, yeah, because there's a bunch of people coming over the hill charging at me. Okay, that's definitely a raid. Raiding with a party of one, that's just turning up, surely. So I don't know. Anyway, it's funny. I must do a raid. I will do a raid. So that would be good. So thank you very much for the raid. Much appreciated. No, we're definitely not. Yeah. So JR9, hold the serious question. We'll get to serious questions, but we're nowhere near serious questions yet. Look, it's only 5 minutes past 8. For goodness sakes, steady on, fella, steady on. So, the Commander O'Connor says, "Trust me, here in Scotland, we will be keeping Zulu time after we ditch the UK." So yes, I suppose it's British summertime. It's not United Kingdom summertime though, is it? So you can't just ditch that. I mean, if it was United Kingdom time, yeah, Scotland might be able to get away with it, but it's not. It's British summertime. So there we go. I don't know how that. But yeah, what's the point? I mean, what does it do? I mean, we spring. I get very confused. All I know is that because I've got a lot of manual clocks in my house, spring is dead easy and autumn is a real pain because anybody who knows proper clocks, okay, you can't wind them backwards. You're not allowed to do that for the very, very good reason that you'll bust them. So if you've got a proper clock, don't wind it backwards. They're not designed to go backwards, okay? So you have to wind them forwards 11 hours in the case of most of the clocks. And I do have a few 24-hour clocks, which of course is 23 hours. You've got to wind them forward rather than one back. And some of them are chiming clocks, and you can't go past the chiming point on some of them because they're old without mucking up the chiming operation either, in which case the chime gets out of sync with the hands, and then you're in all sorts of serious trouble. So you turn it around 1 hour, wait for the chimes to go, and then do it again. So putting the clocks back an hour when you've got a whole bunch of manual clocks is a real faff. So what I generally tend to do is I just let them all run down for a week and then reset them the following weekend. The only problem with that, of course, is that my family justifiably complains that none of the clocks in the house are actually telling the right time. And they seem to be under some strange, inexplicable belief that the clocks in the house should actually bear some relationship to the actual time that the world is in. And I've had to disabuse them of this notion on many occasions. So no, they're just lovely pieces of mechanical artwork. The fact that they tell the time is in no way it's supposed to mean that they're accurate at all. In fact, my clocks are so inaccurate that a clock that isn't working is in fact more accurate than they are most of the time, because of course a clock that isn't working is accurate at least twice a day, as long as you look at it at the right time. So there we go. That's got nothing to do with it. Anyway, daylight saving time, what a stupid idea. Okay, let's just arbitrarily change the time of day during part of the... I mean, we can do maths. We don't need to be told that, actually, no, it's now 8 o'clock. It was 9 o'clock, but no, it's now 8 o'clock. The sun's coming up earlier anyway, because we live on a planet which has an axial tilt. So the days aren't the same length at the same time of the year. We can cope. It's all right. We don't need an arbitrary hour switched off the day. It's like, why do we do this? I've heard no good modern justification for why we have to have a time change at all. Anyway, Mad Microsoft says, Summertime Act came into effect following a campaign by builder William Willett, who proposed the clocks go forward in spring, go back in winter, so that people could save energy and spend more time outdoors during the day. It doesn't make sense. Just start a little later. Isn't that the easiest solution? Do you know what? It's getting dark in the mornings. Tell you what, why don't we get up a bit later? No. It's much simpler just to change the time. It's like, no, it's not. What? Yeah, we used to get up in the dark. Can't we just get up a bit later? Oh look, the sun's come up. Oh, it's 10 o'clock. I mean, it doesn't work. I mean, is it a peculiar? I mean, which countries do savings time? I mean, the US obviously does it because you've already done it. The UK does it. Does the rest? I mean, for those of you in Europe and places farther overseas, I assume that Europe must do it as well. Do southern continents like Australia and New Zealand and Africa and stuff, do they have daylight savings time? I mean, it presumably only affects parts of the planet which are going to have different days because of the season. So it can only be, a certain distance south of the equator where it's actually a problem, because it's not going to work at the equator. It's not going to make any difference at all. But at the North Pole and the South Pole, that's not going to help either, because it just doesn't work. So if we stayed on GMT, we'd have to get up very early to make the best use of daylight and so on. But yeah, so what? Let's just go with the daylight. What is really messy, there are whole states and a few countries and cities in the US who do not change times so much too. So that's even better. So you can shout across the street in America, what time is it? 5 o'clock. Bloody hell, I'm late. And then you get down to your car and it says, actually, no, it's 4. Why do you say it was 5? Well, it's 5 over this side. It's just an arbitrary thing, isn't it? Dear. Australia. Alan says Australia has summertime, but not all states adopt it. So let's have a way of telling the time, but we don't all have to agree to it. So it's like, what time is this train going to arrive? Well, Where are you leaving from? And Indiana and Arizona stay on winter time. It's just stupid. Rowena waves from Arizona. Hello, Arizona. What time is it? I don't know. Arizona doesn't change the daylight savings time. Oh, there we go. So actually, I think Arizona gets my vote of well done. Actually, you get my seal of approval for that, because I think this daylight savings time is complete nonsense, and it should never have been done. It's not a solution to anything. Australia has half. Does he? Oh, hello, Jason Bates. Australia has half-hour increments. Really? And so does India. Wow. Okay, that's even more stupid. What time is it there? It's 2:30. What do you mean 2:30? Well, I mean, different time zones across the width of a continent. That makes sense, because of course we're on a circular planet. A spherical planet. Spherical? Spherical. That's what I mean. Anyway, a planet that goes round, right? It's not a flat Earth. Okay, we're not getting into the flat Earth territory, but anyway, it's a spherical. It's a sphere. Okay, it is a sphere. There's nothing to sphere but sphere itself. Yeah, that makes sense, because it's going to be different on the west coast of America to the east coast. That's about 3 hours time difference. So that does make sense. Okay, it's going to be different in America than it is to the UK, because it's a planet. It's round, and so time zones make sense. But making time zones logical in the sense that on the hour makes sort of sense. I don't say it doesn't seem to be very logical to do it on the half hour to me. Why not do it on the minute? As you drive east or west, then your clock slowly changes. It's like an hour is okay. An hour we can cope with it. It doesn't need to be any more detailed than that. India did it so their clocks wouldn't run parallel to the UK. Okay. Commander Salamander agrees with me. It's just stupid, and we should get rid of it. Yes, I think it is. So Glenn, it says 1:12 p.m. in California. Of course it's 8. It's past 8 here in the UK. So and in Arizona now, even though in the winter we're in. So actually, you can time travel then, Glenn. You can actually time travel in the United States. All you need to do is, you can probably only time travel at certain times of the year, but you can actually do it, because what you need to do is you need to stand on the border between California and Arizona as the clocks change, and you can go back in time an hour. And if you could do that often, well, I mean, obviously it would take a year for it to go around again, so there's no real save, but you can actually time travel in the United States. That's quite impressive, okay? I think we need to try that. In fact, if I ever go to the States again, we're going to have to stand on that border. We're going to organise a trip to the States. We can all time travel together. So we'll have some sort of meet-up. We'll stand on the border between California and Arizona and go back in time. There we go. Just cross the Colorado River at the border. There we go. Perfect. Okay. So we should all be time travellers. That would be awesome. It used to be decided by sundials. Sundials are an excellent invention, of course, because obviously they rely on the position of the sun. The only problem is that sundials don't work in the United Kingdom because, of course, there isn't any sunlight. So they would never have been invented in our country. So the clock was a remarkable invention. So hence military using Zulu time, which is GMT UTC, so it stays the same no matter what. See, I mean, it doesn't have to be GMT. I mean, that's obviously Greenwich Mean Time is GMT, and UTC is the same as Greenwich Mean Time, which I think is a universal. What does UTC mean? Something universal something. I don't know what the U stands for. What does UTC actually mean? I know what it means, but what does it actually mean? If you know what I mean. UTC, Universal Time Constant? I don't know, what does it actually mean? GMT was obviously Greenwich Mean Time. I don't know what short the mean is. Is it average? I mean, mean is average, isn't it? Greenwich Average Time. Doesn't make any sense either. Drew's going to give himself massive jet lag and call it time travel. Dear. Gorfix Star Show said, with time dilation we can age different slower, I think, the people. Yes, I suppose. Commander Claire says universal time cats. Universal coordinated time, says Commander Terakov, unwisely trying to inject some sanity into this conversation. But I like the idea of time travelling back. That would be good. Being West Coast is great for New Year's now that I'm old and I don't want to stay up late. It's always midnight somewhere. So you can save 3 hours on it. That's quite a good idea. Universal Time Coordinated. Is that what it stands for? UTC, Universal Time Coordinated. But we call it Universal Coordinated Time because we can't put the letters in the right order? The Universal Coordinated Time, but the letters are ordered differently because of the French. I see your English people with your English letters in the wrong order. We are going to call it UTC. So what's that? That must translate to something in French then. But time isn't time in French. Time. So what does it actually stand for? I can't believe the French have just deliberately moved the letters around. Your mother smelt of elderberry. It's still unintentional tipsy clocks. So stupid. Why do we do it? Temps coordinate. There we go. Temps universel coordinate. There we go. English, Casper. Wow, all the utterly terrible children. English speakers originally proposed cut, which obviously isn't going to work because that's stupid, for coordinated universal time, while French speakers proposed TUC for temps universel coordinaire. The compromise was UTC. Universal temps coordinaire. Well, there we go. Now that's an interesting piece of history lesson. Unbelievably tiny car. I didn't know that. That's actually quite interesting. I'm going to have to. Bless the French. Bless the French. We love them really. I know we fight wars with them every 200 years, but we love them really. That's really quite interesting. So, and I think that there's a lot of stuff about the French not being very happy with it being GMT because, of course, Greenwich is in the UK, and I think there was an alternative prime meridian, isn't there? Because, of course, the prime meridian for where east and west is measured from runs through Greenwich. And so zero, is it? Which way we get this right? It's longitude, isn't it? Longitude east and west is measured. The zero on the globe it runs a line through Greenwich. Obviously, it's an imaginary line. Although actually, if you do go to Greenwich, there is actually a line which you can stand on because I have stood on it. There is actually a line. It's made of metal. It runs through the Greenwich Observatory. There is actually a small section of the actual Greenwich Meridian that actually runs through Greenwich. But rather amusingly, it's in the wrong place. Because if you go to the Greenwich Meridian where the line is, yeah, and it's sort of built into some cobblestones on the ground, okay, at the Greenwich Observatory. Now the Greenwich Observatory is a wonderful place with a lovely museum and not a bad planetarium and a few other kind of astronomical clocky things. Quite a lot of good stuff there actually. There's some fascinating old clocks and various other bits and pieces around. But the Greenwich Meridian is basically it's like a train, a tram line. It's like a single kind of tram line embedded in the cobblestones at Greenwich Observatory, but it's in the wrong place. Or at least the Americans have decided that it's in the wrong place, should I say, because the Greenwich Meridian was put in the ground based on observations by the Greenwich Observatory, and when the GPS satellites went up, of course, they were way more accurate than any other kind of observation could be. But if you go to Greenwich now and hope to stand on zero, no east, no west, then it turns out that the Greenwich Meridian actually runs through the car park about 100 metres to the east. Not actually on the Greenwich Meridian at all. So I don't know whether that's been done for a laugh by the Americans. Or whether there's just something not quite right with the GPS alignment. I don't know. But the last time I went to the Greenwich Observatory, I went, I'm going to stand on the line. I'm going to snapshot my GPS. But in order to get zero on my GPS, I had to go into the car park. I don't know why. Maybe somebody can explain that to me. So yeah, Jace the Base says that the line is out by about 100 meters, so you have to go about 100 meters east, according to GPS. Now the GPS is an American system, so I reckon they might have just been trolling us. I don't know. GPS isn't accurate. Well, it's accurate. It's accurate down to a few meters. I mean, it's definitely not 100 meters out. So I don't know. I don't know enough about the GPS system to know how it works. Presumably, it's coordinated on something, but I don't know how it works. But anyway, that's a small piece of trivia, that if you ever go to Greenwich and you want to stand on the 0 line, your GPS will be off. Or the line is off. I'm not sure, because it's obviously just an imaginary line. It doesn't really matter anyway, does it? That's how the people in the Greenwich Observatory cafeteria amuse themselves. Where's the Greenwich Meridian? Well, yeah. Yeah, looking through the window and laughing at the people pretending to stand on the 0. So I don't know. That one's a bit odd. That's a bit odd. That is a bit strange. Anyway, of course, time zones, Greenwich Meridian, GPS satellites have got absolutely nothing to do with what I was going to be talking about this evening, as you will not be surprised to know. The Americans just do it because they can to make themselves look good. Well, we love the Americans. Lots of Americans on the stream as well. So just a bit of friendly. Well, yeah. Actually, Europe's supposed to have its own GPS system. Obviously, it's not going to be called GPS because that's what the Americans call theirs. Ours is called something. I can't remember. We have one. Is it either in operation or it's not yet in operation? Quite why we need one, I'm not quite sure. But we've got Europe. Well, Galileo. There we go. Europe is going to have its own GPS, not GPS system, satellite navigation system. Because GPS, I assume, is actually a trade name. We're going to have one, but the UK can't use it anymore, I think, because of Brexit, from what I understand. So there we go. So we may still be using GPS anyway. But never. Galileo, there we go. Galileo, awesome stuff. Time to get on with it, says Jason Face. You're probably right. You haven't been here enough, Jason. We waffle for quite a long time. But we got to the 24-minute mark. That's pretty good, actually. That's not bad. We can't use it anymore. So coming to security concerns. There we go. The garbage positioning system. I don't know what the I knew we were working on. But anyway, that's enough of that. Come on, serious. I'm going to bring this to order now. Because what I want now, as you know, I've been rereading again Lord of the Rings. So, and then obviously an excellent fantasy novel it is too. It's obviously, we've talked about this, but it's the fantasy novel, really, isn't it? Because it's impossible to talk about fantasy novels, particularly high fantasy or epic fantasy that we've sort of been talking about. You can't ignore Tolkien. You just can't, okay, because he's there. And I've been rereading Lord of the Rings, and I've just got to the end of book 3. And we had fun, and we had fun the other week trying to figure out the difference between what Tolkien calls a novel, which is the entire thing, the Lord of the Rings, the 3 volumes of his novel, of course, one of which is the Fellowship of the Ring, one of which is the Two Towers, one of which is Return of the King, and then the 6 books that are the summation of the 3 volumes of the one novel. Why he had to do that, I've got no idea, but that's what he did. So I am now exactly at the halfway mark in Lord of the Rings. So I finished book 3, I'm halfway through volume 2, and I'm halfway through the Two Towers, and therefore halfway through the entire book, if that makes sense. So, but what I was interested in, actually, I was rereading the section on the attack on Helms Deep by the orcs of Saruman the Wise, or Saruman the White, as he was at that point in the story. So, and it was interesting to read this because, of course, a battle scene. Okay, a battle scene is a fundamental staple of a lot of fantasy novels. You either use the battle as a place to kind of kick things off, because either you win or lose a battle, and things are cast asunder, or a castle is destroyed or taken, or a land is conquered, and all those kind of good things. Or it's the set piece at the end. right? Whereby, right, the powers of good have got all their guys together and assembled. The odds are against us, but cue the enemy having vast hordes of whatevers coming to assault your citadel or your castle or your fortress or whatever it happens to be, and then the plucky heroes will usually win by some obscure means. Especially usually when everything's looking at its darkest, and then the battle will be won against all the odds, and the heroes are vindicated. The enemy is defeated and cast down, etc., destroyed, defeated, blah 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 blah, and boom, excellent. There's the end of the story. Fantastic. Well done. Good. We finished a fantasy novel. Huzzah! But the battles are quite interesting. Now, I must admit, I remember going to see Lord of the Rings at the cinema. Oh, another raid. What's happening? Have I missed something? Drum roll. Tonight's topic is so all the huons. Yes, so a few little bits of mine. But I remember going to see Lord of the Rings at the cinema back in, it must have been, was it 2001, 2002, 2003, I think, when those films came out. And I remember thinking, I wonder how they're going to do this, because I remember thinking, they'd done some, the CGI was now up to doing vast epic battles, which of course Lord of the Rings has, which is one of the things that they never felt they could do up until that point cinematically, because they just couldn't get the number of people together. But what I remember being totally impressed with when I went to see the cinema is, the attack on Helm's Deep. That one comes back to me most out of all the battles that are in Lord of the Rings is the battle against Helm's Deep, because there's the opening shot of what's his name, King of Rohan, Theoden, standing there with his "So it begins." It's all very epic, isn't it? How did it come down to this? All those sort of excellent quotes, which I do like. They're kind of like, I know you're going to say something epic at this point, so go on then, Mr. Theoden. How did it come down to this? Yeah. Those good quotes. I mean, you've got to do it because it's epic. You've got to have epic phrases come out. So it begins. I do like his kind of. I mean, it's quite. When I first watched it, I was kind of lost in the moment. But the second few times I watched it, I was thinking, is he talking about the fact it's just started raining, or that the orcs are coming towards him? Because you kind of look at his face, and in that moment it starts raining, and you always get that kind of British. So it begins. The rain's coming down, and then you look at it. Actually, no, it's the orcs coming up the valley. So it begins. That bit. But what impressed me the most about that is there's this panning shot early on where one of the orcs is sort of standing on the rock, guiding everybody forward, saying, "Go and attack the fortress of Helm's Deep." And Helm's Deep, of course, is this beautiful. Actually, it's quite interesting design. It's this sort of big wall with a citadel at kind of one end of the wall. And you're looking at this. I was looking at this thinking, okay, well, how are the orcs going to storm this? Because there is a sort of walkway up, but it's very narrow and exposed. And then you've just got this sheer wall, of which, the defenders are on the top of the wall, and the orcs are sort of charging towards. And so, well, and there's archers and all sorts of things. And yes, they've got a few. Crossbows which they can pick off the defenders with, but the defenders are actually in a much stronger position at that point. So it seems to me, because they've got the height advantage. I have the high ground. They've got the height advantage, and they're shooting down, and the orcs are just sort of flooding up against these very, very tall walls. And what are they going to do? They haven't apparently brought any siege weapons with them. And then what actually gave me a real thrill of fear actually watching it was, and the hairs, I remember distinctly the hairs on the back of my neck rising up in kind of like, oh my God, was when the ladders came up. Okay. And so if you watch that scene again, there's a coordinated moment where the orcs have brought these big long ladders with them, which are, curiously enough, exactly the right length. So they've obviously measured it with a theodolite or something at some point to design these ladders. But they bring these ladders up and they jam these ladders into the ground and they tilt them forward. And they do it in a synchronized fashion. So they all go up like in a swirling kind of motion. And and they land on the walls, and somehow the orcs are straight up there, and within minutes the walls are under attack by orcs piling over the top. And I remember thinking, oh my god, if that was real, how demoralising that would be to be a defender on the wall, suddenly seeing these orcs coming up over on those ladders. It was a moment where I thought, wow, attacking a castle is something you don't just surprisingly enough, you don't just charge at the castle and hope for the best. You have to have a plan, and the orcs in the environment did have a plan. It was I thought very well choreographed. And it was enough for me to go off after the film and go, well, how do you attack a castle in real life? Assuming you don't have cannons and you don't have aerial capability, how do you attack a castle? So that was interesting, how to improve the Battle of Helms Deep, when he says, so it begins. Up with the umbrella. That would be awesome. Have you seen the extended box set extras? They talk about how the scene was done. I haven't. I must admit, I probably need to go and watch that, actually, because I think I've got the director's cut, but I don't think I've watched all the extra bits. I just haven't had the time. So ladder length is something they could have got from Grimer over the years. Yeah, so Grimer Wormtongue was sort of stealing secrets, but I just thought that choreographed attack on Helm's Deep was actually very impressive not just as a visual spectacle, of course, which it was, but as a tactic. Because that was like that. Would that actually work? It looked good enough that I think that as an attack on a wall, if you could keep your ladder raisers defended, with crossbows. I mean, yes, you're going to be suffering massive casualties all the time because of the bows and the arrows raining down upon you, but if you can get people up onto the walls, you've got a chance of overcoming, because otherwise you're just sort of sloshing around down the bottom and just getting picked off slowly and surely. And there's no other way to get to the top, but get to the walls, overflow the walls, and you're in good place. So I thought that was interesting. I thought that was very interesting. You breach the wall with siege engineer. So I went away after that thinking, well, how did people actually attack castles? And it depended. Interestingly enough, castle building and fortress building is an interesting piece of history, because it evolved relatively quickly, even in countries that actually had it. Now, this is mostly limited to Europe, because and the Near East, really, near to Middle East, because castles were a sort of invention from about 800 AD onwards, and then they sort of became a bit obsolete by sort of 1400. So they didn't really had a 600-year period when a castle was actually worth having, because technology went past it quite quickly. So in the early days, it would have been a hill fort, right, with a wooden palisade around it, which just gave you some protection against people shooting arrows. But they were very, very, very vulnerable to being set on fire. So that idea didn't last very long. And then you started building them out of stone. But the problem with building things out of stone was it was a really expensive thing to do, because you had to pay people to chisel them out and move blocks of stone around, which people aren't generally inclined to do unless there's a good reason to do. And building a castle was a very, very, very expensive thing to do, very, very costly. You'd start off with a central keep, and then the idea of having different walls around it would come in, and then you'd have the towers, and then you'd have somebody's already mentioned it, murder holes, and all the other clever defensive mechanisms. And I remember going to see and then you've got portcullises and the moats and all sorts of things. The classic castle with its kind of crenellations, towers, portcullis, and a moat is actually quite a late development in the history of fortified things, to the point at which they were almost becoming a bit pointless by that point, because there were so many other ways to deal with it. There's a particular castle not far from me, which is Bodiam Castle. If you look up Bodiam, I'll type it in the chat just in case, for those of you who don't live locally. Bodiam Castle. It's worth looking up, because when you look at it, you think, wow, what an amazing castle. It looks awesome. It looks like a proper fairy tale castle. It's got towers, it's got a moat, it's got a drawbridge, it's got everything, it's got little places to shoot arrows out of. But when you look at it carefully, you realise actually it's a complete fairy tale castle. It never fought a battle, it never survived a battle, it was never actually in a battle. It's a medieval imagining of what a castle should look like. And actually it isn't now, it's a museum, but it was a stately home which looked like a castle. And the owner got permission from the king to put crenellations on the top, ostensibly to defend against the French, again, believe it or not. But it's not a proper castle because it couldn't actually stand up to an invasion. If you look at the design of it, you realise that the moat around the castle, all you'd have to do to get rid of the moat is to dig a tunnel near to it, because the moat is on an elevated part of the plain. So all you need to do is drill a small hole, and the entire moat will drain away quite quickly, which gets rid of that particular problem. And the walls weren't thick enough to survive being bombarded with anything. It's a Bodiam Castle is a lovely place, but it's a fake castle. So all those sort of things. Now, Jason's mentioned one that's in the Holy Grail. Now there's plenty of castles in the Holy Grail, which is a fun film, which is not to be taken too seriously at all. But there's another one, Doune Castle, which is in Scotland, is a proper castle, and it's a very, very different design, because actually I've walked up there with a pair of coconuts, obviously, and it's got proper murder holes, and it's got places to shoot people out of, and it's actually a very interesting design. But castles went through this kind of arms race really, really quickly, because people realised that in order to deal with a castle, you could either assault it directly, i.e. chuck rocks at it. So the early design of castles were very, very easy to break down by just hurling great rocks at them. So the catapults and the trebuchets and things like that were very, very good at knocking castles down. So of course, in order to stop them being knocked down, then they had to build them much, much stronger. So then castles sort of went width-wise, and make them a bit more impervious to having rocks chucked at them. Then people started going, well, we'll just bring in the miners. So you basically dug tunnels and undermined the castle, so that basically the ground above it sank away. The ground below it rather sank away, and then the sides of the castle would collapse. So that was another technique that they used. The other one was, of course, just starve them out. My favourite technique of actually making castles surrender, which apparently was quite successful, was to just chuck rancid corpses of animals and anything else you could find over the walls, and they eventually succumbed to disease. Which is sort of like a very, very early biological warfare version of attacking a castle. So, then gunpowder was invented, and the moment gunpowder was invented, then that was effectively, castles became utterly pointless, because you could build these ridiculous. There's nothing stone and rock can do against being hit by cannonballs, and that was kind of the end. And at that point, castles all across Europe fell into disuse, because they were expensive heirlooms of a previous time, and the reign of the castles was over. It didn't last very long. So all those sort of things are quite interesting. Which brings me around to the point about fantasy novels. Okay, is you always have. I mean, you go through Lord of the Rings. You've got Helms Deep. You've got obviously the towers, which look fairly interesting fortifications. You've got Minas Tirith, of course, which are big fortresses of men primarily. It seems that men, as in the race of men, as it's mentioned in the book, are the ones who have the like building fortresses. So those sort of things. It's interesting that, and again, we've talked about the fact that the fantasy world's technology never ever moves on, and it's interesting actually to observe, and it's a much bigger thing is made of it in the Lord of the Rings films than in the book. Helm's Deep is that they put effectively a bomb of some kind in the in a rather conveniently. It's called a culvert in the book. It's basically sort of a drain that runs out through the walls. why the architect of Helm's Deep thought, I know, we'll put a vulnerable. I mean, it's very Death Starry to my way of thinking. Let's put a small hole, little arched bit, in the bottom of our wall. Which is a tempting target for orcs to put mischief into. It's only about a paragraph in the actual Lord of the Rings book. It's called The Culvert of Helm's Deep, and Aragorn spots the orcs putting the fire of Orthanc into it, and of course the whole thing blows up. It's much bigger in the movies than it is in the in the book, but it's a little bit of a design flaw. But maybe it just, they never anticipated explosives being used in a fantasy realm, which is an interesting thing for talking to added, because it's like, okay, so suddenly you've got gunpowder. That is actually going to render all sorts of things obsolete very, very quickly if gunpowder is allowed to exist in the Lord of the Rings, which it apparently does. But nobody ever uses it again. And you're kind of left scratching your head. Where did Saruman get that from? And what, it should have done better with all the technology of this thing. So were fortified settlements before Norman castles, of course. That's why the Romans had to besiege Elysia and Masada. Yes, so actually the story of Masada is a horrific one. Actually, I remember I've visited Masada in Israel, and that's one hell of a story. That is. Poison the castle's water supply, and you'll have the capitulation in 3 days. You see, so those sort of things as well made castles actually slightly less plausible than anything else. You could either starve them out, or you could, like you say, cut off the water supply. So I don't know. I mean, yes, I suppose there was a valley there that needed to drain. Otherwise, you would have had a very early dam, wouldn't you? Which probably wasn't the design. Well, that's a good point, actually, Jayton666. Gandalf must know about gunpowder too, because he uses it in fireworks. Now, they're sort of magically enhanced fireworks, aren't they? That always is interesting to me. The other thing, the general warfare, though, we've talked about this in previous streams, but the general warfare in fantasy novels is very much in that European medieval sort of thing. The most advanced technology you tend to see is your kind of classic old school siege engines, isn't it? So you see battering rams, we see those in Lord of the Rings. You see trebuchets, lobbing rocks and things. You see catapults, you see ballista type weapons, sort of slightly Roman-esque type things. And so, interesting enough, the sciences of trajectories, because when the medieval guys rocked up with their siege engines, and by siege engines I'm covering the whole kind of gamut of things that you would attack a castle with, right? So strictly speaking, the siege engine is the thing that you push against the tower on wheels, climb up, and then use that to get onto the tower, which the orcs do use in the attack on Minas Tirith. So that's technically is a siege engine, but all the weapons that are in that kind of category, so trebuchets, ballistas, catapults, etc. You don't just decide to go and build one of them on the off chance it's going to work. There is actually some maths involved because you have to know how strong to build the things in order to hurl a certain amount of stuff, and you need to have a basic working knowledge of ballistics in order to make one effectively. So you're not going to rock up with a siege engine that you haven't tested. Now they won't necessarily be millimetric accurate, but the people who operated trebuchets would be able to consistently hit a target with them. Okay, so they're not. This is not just something you just muck about with. The people operating those were experts in their field of attacking castles. They knew what they were doing. They would build trebuchets to be able to hurl particular size rocks at a particular distance, and you could set your trebuchet to different ranges if you so wish, and the angle of which it would release and all those sort of things had been worked out. So they were quite sophisticated pieces of technology. Okay, so you can't just you don't just build a trebuchet. You have to work it out how to make it strong and so on and so forth. Now they were potentially vulnerable to being attacked by people with fire and stuff, but most trebuchets could operate outside the range of archers. Okay, so they were quite good at demoralizing your enemy, because if they could damage your castle from a remote distance and you didn't have anything to fire back with, it would definitely soften up the target, I think, as people in battle say. So the siege towers are less realistic. You do see them quite a lot in fantasy, and I think Glenn's already said that. They're not as realistic because if you look at the way you have to push them really, really slowly to get into range. And of course, they're usually made of wood. Now, I don't know about you, but I've got a plan when it comes to things that are made out of wood that are made working very, very slowly. Most of the attacks on castles were much, much more messy. Okay, so the battering ram technique does work, okay, because the door in the castle wall is the weakest part of the castle wall, so it's obviously going to be the bit that you attack. So getting rid of the defenders on the wall is also important. So you do have an advantage shooting down, but you're not invulnerable, which is why you get the crenellation. So you have to sort of take cover. Now, if you're a good archer or you're a good crossbow, what's the name for a crossbow person? Is it still an archer? Because an archer to me is a bowman. Who's a guy who holds a crossbow? Have they got a collective noun? So all those sort of things. Throughout medieval warfare, it is just a crossbowman or an archer. Okay. Cleonimus says, I always put a false door on the thickest part of the wall. That's a very good idea. Though I suspect some people might do a bit of reconnaissance of your castle to figure out how to attack it best. But yeah, most of the battles were quite messy. You basically tried a good technique for dealing with the door was it's made of wood, right? So you basically try and set fire to it. So you just chuck lots and lots of hot fiery things at it in the hope that some of them will catch and burn the door. And of course the defenders are trying to extinguish the flames at the same time. So it becomes a battle of who's got the best armament again. Can you get close to the door to ram it, in which case you need to have dealt with some of the defenders on the wall, at least got enough covering fire. And that's the way the battles tended to go. It was an ebb and flow of how good the attackers or defenders were to deal with the actual doorway. And once the doorway was breached, then the castle would tend to fall, because that's the way it would go. So you wouldn't have quite so many of these elaborate mechanisms. The catapults and the trebuchets are very much realistic. They would use those to lob things at the fire. One of the things that you see in fantasy films that really has no relation to reality at all is the concept of fiery arrows. Okay, so you see this a lot in fantasy films. It makes me chuckle, because let's light our arrows. With some pitch or something. So you supposedly stick the end of your arrow in some pitch, light it, and then shoot it at the enemy, because it looks cool, I assume. But that doesn't have much basic in actual warfare either, because it's quite impractical and quite dangerous to be lighting fires all the way along your army. It also makes your army quite easy to see. It's like, look there, shoot at them. See where all those lighty arrows are? That's where the baddies are. Let's shoot them. So that and then the arrows are supposed to be flying through the sky. Now they've tested this idea, and there aren't any materials that they can make where the arrows stay alight during the fiery bit very well. So fiery arrows look good, and they're almost in all fantasy films. I don't know, are they in Lord of the Rings? I can't remember. But they shouldn't be, because they're very silly. Okay, so none of that lighty arrow stuff. And the other one that is quite interesting is the concept of night arrows, which kind of quite often goes with the lighty up arrows. Is that you sneakily send some flaming arrows first, and then you send a whole bunch of arrows that aren't lit. So just as the defenders are going, "Way, we survived the fiery arrows," they put their shields down, and then they will get slaughtered by the invisible arrows that they can't see coming. That doesn't happen either. You just fire arrows, okay? You just try and kill each other. At least there wasn't a great deal of chivalry when it came to that kind of warfare. You're just trying to kill the other guys as effectively as possible. That's how you won. By killing the other guys, okay? And if It wasn't a case of, well, actually, it's their turn now. Let's let them have a shot, see what they come up. Oh, look, they're firing their trebuchets. Well, that's good. Now it's our turn to roll the dice. We'll fire. Let's do the fiery arrows. It wasn't like that. Okay, you didn't take turns. You just tried to kill them. And whether that was by shooting them with arrows or whether you dropped stones on them or whatever it happened to be, you were just trying to win. It was desperate times. Okay, so none of that sort of honourable turn taking that you sometimes see in fantasy. That's not true either. Arrows are magical, so actually, so siege towers, they weren't really used in medieval Europe. But yes, I've definitely heard of them in more antiquated, antiquated. That's not right. Times of antiquity. That's what I want to say. Once, but you needed to. They were sort of, I suppose, in modern parts, they're a bit like a sort of tactical bomber, really, in the sense that you need to make sure you've got rid of the you've got air cover before you send in those devices, because there's no point sending them in at the beginning of the battle because you haven't got enough. They're too vulnerable. So it's a case of tactics, and it depends what target you're attacking, and a lot of it depended on the landscape that you were operating under. I mean, if you had a nice flat plain like Minas Tirith where you could put these huge enormous things across, fabulous. But certainly in the UK, there are very, very few places where it would be possible to push such a huge thing up the hill. So quite often you had to assemble them on site, which was fraught with difficulty. So all sorts of problems with those sort of things trying to attack castles. Best way to bring a castle down I can recall reading is diverting a small river by night to undermine foundations. Undermining foundations was definitely a thing. I mean, Rochester Castle in Kent, which isn't all that far from me, is a classic old school castle, a really nice example of an old castle, and it has got three. It's actually like a square box, but it has three square turrets and one circular turret. And you look at it and think, well, why the hell did they do one circular turret and three square ones? You think you're kind of looking at it. The reason it's got one circular turret and three square ones is that one of the corners was undermined in an actual fight. So it's actually a castle that's properly seen some action. And one side of the castle actually was compromised. One corner of the castle was actually compromised, and the tower fell down, allowing people in to do all their slaughtering and stuff that they usually did. They did rebuild the castle, but castle technology had moved on at the point they rebuilt it, and they'd figured out that a flat-sided turret was more at risk of being hit by cannon fire, and a circular turret was more likely for the attacking cannonball to bounce off or shear off at an angle. So when they rebuilt the fourth turret that had fallen down, they built it as a circular turret rather than a square one. So you can see the evolution of thinking in the design of castles, which is quite cool. We're going to have a look at it. So if you're ever across to the UK, Rochester Castle is a castle that had actually seen some action a long time ago. And there are loads, and Conway Castle in Wales, there are loads of good castles in Wales. In fact, there are quite a lot of castles all across the UK, which tells you a lot about our history. You're not going to want to push a siege tower up a hill. That's not going to work. All sorts of interesting things like that about castles. But in fantasy, the castle is always, it's always the same technology, You always have the battle, which takes place around the castle, and you have all these weird and wonderful ways of attacking the castle. And Lord of the Rings, I think, does it quite well. Other than the for some strange reason, Sauron doesn't make nearly as much advantage of his flying creatures as he should, because he's got effectively with the Nazgul. Other than the fear and the terror and everything else that goes with the Nazgul flying around in the sky, he's got total and utter air superiority, as I think the Americans would call it, over Minas Tirith. And he can bomb them to oblivion from the sky using his flying, flapping creatures, whatever those are. not to mention that the Nazgul are obviously utterly terrifying anyway. And the Nazgul do quite a good job, actually, to start with. Of, there's a particular scene I remember thinking that one of the Nazgul comes down, grabs, I think, one of the Minas Tirith catapults in his claws, rips it to shreds, and casts the men who were manning it to oblivion down the side of the city, and then sort of flies off with the wreckage in its claws. And you think, and I was looking at that thinking, Minas Tirith is doomed. There's no way it's going to win here. Because how can you repel that? Because all you need to do is you give the Nazgul instructions, right, take out all the defences. That's all you need to do. Take out all the defences. What we'll do is we'll leave our army outside. We don't need to attack the city at all. We're just going to pummel it into oblivion with the catapults. Once we've disarmed the city, we'll just keep chucking fire over, and eventually they're just going to have to give up. So Minas Tirith should have easily been defeated by the forces of Sauron with the Nazgul. The Nazgul seem to have problems in not being very effective when it comes to the punch. They're really, really good in the run up, and then they sort of go, "Nah, we've done enough." So if you're going to have really, really high-powered servants of evil, make sure you use them. Is my advice to Sauron. And interesting, actually, that's the only time that Gandalf actually really demonstrates some magic, isn't it? Because he lights up his staff and sends the Nazgul away when they're dealing with trying to get Faramir back, aren't they? So Blue Ganymede, I thought the best way to bring down castle walls is to blow a lot of trumpets. Well, that apparently works in the Bible. I don't know if that's a sound military strategy or not. But in medieval times I would agree, but in ancient times they didn't really have the ranged weapon to do serious damage. Yeah, so the catapult technology wasn't the same. I mean, the Romans had some pretty good weapons, but so the people of Rohan would have probably been safer up in Edoras on that massive hill. I don't know about that, because the orcs did have overwhelming numbers. At least with Helms Deep, they were sort of constrained in the valley, weren't they? So whilst they did have an awful lot of numbers, they couldn't all get to Helms Deep. Helms Deep was constricted in the valley, whereas Edoras is on top of a hill. The orcs could have surrounded it from all directions, and I think probably quite quickly overwhelmed it, because it was made of B, it was on it was on the exposed hill which you could surround, and B, it was made of wood. It would not have lasted long in a fight, I don't think. So yeah, actually, it's interesting reading it, because I'm trying to do it from a kind of tactical perspective, or a strategic perspective, actually, probably more accurately. It's like Sauron misses so many opportunities to completely wipe out the good guys, doesn't he? It's like even in the first book, where you've got the nine ring wraiths are so powerful that nobody can stand against them, but they manage to attack Frodo on Weathertop, of course, and they but rather than just kill him and take the ring when they've totally overpowered him, they decide to, no, we'll just stab him and run away, because there's a guy there with a flaming branch. So we're obviously quite scared of that. So it's so they're sometimes ridiculously overpowered and sometimes rather underwhelming, the Nazgul. But I must admit, visually and kind of accurately, I think the Helm's Deep battle feels more genuine to me than the one for Minas Tirith, at least visually. I remember watching the Helm's Deep battle, thinking, actually, I can imagine this actually taking place with the technology that's going on. Maybe the bomb is a bit too far-fetched, but the rest of it felt quite kind of good to me. Is that Helm's Deep was well defended and they did quite a good job, but they succumbed quite quickly to the attack because of the overwhelming numbers and the fact that the orcs were prepared. I thought it was actually quite good. Whereas Minas Tirith looked like a little Minas Tirith itself, this massive, it's like a wedding cake kind of city, isn't it? It goes on and on and on and on, so many tiers up. It's so high up. That bit at the top it's like, I don't know, it must be like about 2,000 feet up. I don't know how tall Minas Tirith is supposed to be, but it's ridiculously, hugely enormous. So I felt that the design of Helm's Deep was actually much better. Minas Tirith had the problem that they It's just they didn't seem to have enough men, I think, to man the place, which was partly the problem. It didn't just. I suppose Minas Tirith to me didn't look very realistic, whereas Helms Deep looked like a proper fortress, the sort of stuff that you might imagine actually being built. So I don't know. So anyway, from a fantasy novel perspective, the battle for the thing, and I've had this problem with Lords of Midnight and Doomdark's Revenge, is that in those games, battling for the fortress is a big deal, because you kind of have to stage yourself, and most role playing games and those kind of things, that attacking the castle, gaining the castle is quite a big deal. But the other problem that you have with these sort of battles is that they were very, very difficult things to get right, because all the castle had to do, and it was depending on the weather, of course. The weather would turn battles quite a lot more often than the strategies themselves would. Is that keeping an army attacking a castle is actually a very expensive thing to do as well, because people who and they were mostly men, obviously, in those days. People in an army need to eat food, and so in order to keep an army provisioned to keep attacking things, then you have to keep them fed. And so when you look at the army that's attacking both Helm's Deep and Minas Tirith, you're looking at the size of the army that Sauron was able to field and march across the plains there, or Saruman in the case. It's like they've gone on a multi-day march in order to get. You can't just turn up at Minas Tirith or Helm's Deep that afternoon. You have to plan this thing. So if you want to attack a citadel or a city or a fortress like that, you've got to have a supply line. You've got to have some guys who are basically bringing provisions along. Okay, you can't just march there and hope for the best. That's not going to work, because particularly if it's a multi-day siege, your guys are going to get tired. They're going to want some food. They're going to want some drink. So actually keeping your army healthy and able to fight was as serious a challenge as actually dealing with the thing that you were going off to go and fight against. So all those things are quite important, which, outside of the fantasy realm, people who actually fought real battles against castles had to deal with that fact. You couldn't just march to the castle and go, right, let's have at it. You had to think about, okay, well, what are we going to eat this evening? If assuming we're still here and we haven't got through the castle, what are we going to eat? But orcs eat the dead. Well, I suppose orcs are cannibals. Maybe that works okay. Yes, meat's back on the menu, boys. All that sort of stuff. That's true. Maybe they just ate each other. I'm not sure that's particularly good for morale. Not being an orc warrior myself, I'm not sure how that works out. But I assume they had some sort of alternative plan rather than to eat each other. Because the only problem with that is that how many men did we lose today? How many orcs did we lose today? Do you mean to enemy action or to our own people? Well, we started off with 20,000 orc warriors. 5,000 of them fell in battle. Well, we ate them. But we're still hungry, so we had to sacrifice another 3,000 more. So this morning, we've only got 13,000 orc warriors to attack the citadel with. Oh, okay then. How many more days can we go? Well, if we don't eat too many people, we've probably got another 3 weeks, sir. But if we eat more, the battle will be over in 5 days. So I don't know. But eating each other was I don't think was a tactic that medieval armies were generally all that favour of. So I don't think that was what they did in medieval Europe. I suspect they had to be fed with other stuff. And the way a lot of this was done, basically, you would go raiding, the available countryside around. So actually, having a battle anywhere nearby in your particular part of the world in medieval Europe was a really bad thing. Okay, because not only would the castle potentially be attacked, and lots of people would be killed, which obviously was bad because it's likely that somebody you knew was going to be in that castle. Probably a family member. But what would happen is that the attacking army would raid anything hereabouts, any farmstead, any village, any hamlet, anywhere nearby for food and provisions. So not only would you have to deal with the fact that your castle was under attack, you'd also have to deal with the fact that the invading army was rampaging through your land, stealing all your cattle, and everything else that they could get their hands on. So it was very, very disruptive and very, very expensive for everybody involved. Bad news, lads. Not enough of you died to provide food to survivors. We're going to have to draw straws. Yeah, there's going to be a lottery this morning, gents. Who's going to be food, and who's going to actually go into battle? So you had to be very careful looking after your army, because it would be very easy to lose your army, not because you got killed by the enemy, but because you didn't feed them properly, or they succumbed to disease. Medieval times were generally bad news for the peasants all the time. And this is an interesting thing, because in Lords of Midnight, of course, the book that I wrote a few years ago, you've got the added complication that everything is freezing cold. The entire land has been cursed into in an eternal winter, which is again quite a nice sort of epic fantasy thing. Let's chuck a few extra things in there. On one hand, that's really nice. It's it's going to be jolly pretty. There's a bit of snow and a bit of frost around. Of course, one of the problems with Lords of Midnight in that regard is actually in the game you've got big armies. I mean, if you count up the total number of armies, there's something like 15,000 warriors and riders all trudging about the plains, attacking each other, in a snowy wasteland where not very much grows, and you've got to keep these guys fed. The game, of course, doesn't take this into account. So it's like, okay, so 15,000 men are marching up and down a snowy wasteland. Where's the food coming from? So that's a problem. And in Lord of the Rings, you kind of have a similar sort of thing. These huge armies are moving about. Where do they get their food from? What do they eat? So it became a problem. As armies got bigger, you can't feed them. That became an issue. And even into modern warfare, I mean, even in World War I and World War II, keeping your army fed was a major logistical thing that you had to deal with, because people need food. Orcs could just eat their toes. They don't need those. I love that line. That's so good. What about their legs? What about their legs? They don't need their legs. And I think is it Churchill maybe or somebody else, I don't know. An army marches on its stomach. That's a very good line, because it's very, very true. If you don't keep your guys fed and happy, they're not going to be very effective at warfare at all. So if you're bringing this back to the fantasy stuff, if you're writing fantasy, you kind of got, again, this comes down to choices as a writer. You can kind of gloss over these problems. It's what I call the horse principle. In most fantasy novel, horses are a bit like cars. Okay, so you don't get in your horse. that would be very wrong. But you get on your horse and you ride your horse to where it is you need to go. Okay. Now, horse, and a lot of novelists, fantasy novelists, treat horses like cars. You just get on your horse and you ride it until you get to the end of the destination. Horses don't do that. Okay. Horses get tired. They're animals. You can't just top them up with horse fluid. Like you can, you can't. You fill up a car with petrol, and when a car runs out of petrol, it isn't exhausted in the sense that it's tired out. You just fill it up with petrol, and it's ready to go again. Okay, a car can effectively go on forever as long as there's petrol. Horses don't work like that. Okay, you can't get to the end of riding your horse and say, right, horse, here's some food, here's some water, off we go again for another 40 miles. Horses don't work like that. Okay. Horses are animals, and you get a lot of. I always chuckles when I hear fantasy novels, and they ride their horses into battle, having left the previous morning. They've ridden all day, and then they're going to charge into battle. The horses just won't do that. You've got to look after your horse. So there are physical limitations onto what some of these animals can do. So it's like a space fantasy horse, yeah. You can fill a horse with petrol, but it won't end well. So now you can't just decide to ride, all day on a horse. A horse just can't do that. Okay, I always felt the When in Lord of the Rings where Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, they've taken the hobbits to Isengard, that bit, and they run like non-stop for 3 days. It's like, really? I mean, there's really, really extremely fit people on Earth today who can run, run a marathon, but they can't do it for 3 days solid. And according to Lord of the Rings, Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas ran about 250 miles over the course of 3 days, so which is pretty darn fast. That's just not feasible. Okay, you just can't do that. Unless they're sort of magic. I mean, maybe the elves are magic, and maybe the dwarves have got longevity. But and presumably Aragorn, of course, is the race of Numenor, so maybe they're a bit stronger. But there are. That's quite that is stretching the imagination a bit. And horses won't do that either. Horses will get tired, and you can't recharge them that fast. You have to wait a day. There are some ultramarathons. Yeah, that's fair enough, Zomba. You can get some extraordinarily fit people who can do those kind of things, but not normally carrying a pack of stuff and be prepared to fight at the end of it, I don't think. There's a 250-kilometre marathon in Greece. Wow. Okay, so that's quite impressive, actually. So maybe does that take place consecutively though? I mean, are they not allowed to? Do they get some sleep? I suppose they certainly weren't ordinary people, but I remember thinking it's starting to get a bit that stuff to me starts to get a little bit too fantastical. So things like that. But so you've got to again as a writer you've got to sit down and think, okay, in my magical realm, okay, is magic something that allows my characters to do extraordinary things? If you stick to the rules, that's fine. Okay, so if you set the rules that actually people in your world can run, in extremis, they wouldn't necessarily want to do it all the time. They can run 100 miles in a day, then okay, but kind of stick to that as a rule. And the same, if you want to magically endow your horses with the ability to gallop for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, then you can. But then you're kind of it depends again. It depends. How serious do you want your book to be? Lord of the Rings is fairly serious most of the time, but there are some aspects of it where that kind of creeps in. It's like, okay, but I'm not sure a horse can actually do that. But Lord of the Rings kind of gets away with it by basically saying, well, these horses are special horses and they're descendants of a master race of horses, which is quite a nice way to do it. So you've kind of got levels of capability, and the same with Aragorn, who's able to live to like 250 years and all those kind of things. So he's like a superior race of men, which fair enough. That differentiates that kind of stuff. So that to me is Tolkien thinking about the problem and giving it a rationale. I think that's good. However, if you get novels where the horse can just be like a car and you can just keep riding it forever, so no, I think you might need to have a rest in there somewhere. And sometimes those moments in the story are quite nice for pacing and characters having conversations with each other as well. So there we are, 240. Wow. Okay, so Chris Vikings checked that. 246 kilometres, finishing time seemed to be around 25. So there you go. Okay, well that's interesting. That's a long old way. So 246 kilometres is about 180 miles, and it takes them 25 to 70 hours to run that. Wow, that is actually scarily impressive. So maybe it's not actually as outrageous as it sounds. Very rare individuals who can do this, which is fine. Okay, if you've got a rare individual, I think that's quite good. It is, and Glenn is quite. It is fantasy, Druids. Now, and not hard sci-fi. It depends on what you're. See, this is the thing. But my concern with these sort of things is that in a fantasy novel, if the good guys have access to the untiring horses or the ability to run things, and the bad guys don't, it makes it a bit unbalanced for the poor bad guys. I always feel sorry for the bad guys in movies because they never seem to get the best stuff, and they never seem to get any luck. That's the other thing that the good guys always seem to have a lot of. it's nice to see a fantasy novel where the good guys don't make stupid mistakes because of reasons, and b, the magic in the world is theirs to command as well. So the ultimate outcome of the thing becomes a test of skill rather than a test of, darn, the goodies have outsmarted us with the super magical horse again. I wish we had a super magical horse, but we don't, because we're the bad guys. We just have to put up with what we've got. So, and the horses of Marrels. Hard fantasy is just historical fiction. So I see where you're coming from, and you don't want to take it too seriously because you take some of the fun away from it. But there's a fine line between having a fantasy which is sort of believable in the context of itself, because obviously a fantasy, an epic fantasy story isn't possible. Magic doesn't exist in the real world. We know that, and we'd like it to exist in the context of the story. But magic has to have some limitations, and Lord of the Rings is actually quite good in this regard, I think, in the sense that magic in Lord of the Rings is very subtle. It's kind of in the fabric of the world rather than Harry Potter style incantations, which again is all quite good fun. I don't dislike Harry Potter stories from that perspective, but that's very much swish and flick, isn't it? Boom. Which again is fun storytelling, but doesn't make a great deal of sense actually. If you can magic up things, then some of the problems that they face should be you just magic them away. Those sort of problems, and that's like, it's a good point actually. Kelly Bagler makes the Uruk-hai of Saruman were able to run non-stop as well. They were very fast as well. So Aragorn, Gimli, and they were struggling to keep up with them and overtake them, weren't they? So so the bad guys did have some good shots in there. That's true. The Nazguls, I think, are they definitely didn't use the Nazguls to best effect. That was. So that one I don't think worked very well. Why have I got a Route 66 badge? Because I just fancied it this evening. It's got nothing to do with anything, I'm afraid. So logical reasons don't really make sense in fantasy because, of course, there isn't much logic in a fantasy. But rules do make sense, and I think if you're paying a lot of as Tolkien does, for example, to some sort of some of the military warfare stuff. It's nice to have it represented as well. The other thing with swords, of course, and weapons is, and I think bows and arrows are the most abused ones, because the best bowmen in medieval battles, particularly if you were a longbowman, you had a really, really heavy longbow. Now they were dangerous, okay, so you could kill things up to 200 yards quite easily with a longbow. They were very, very powerful weapons up until the point where rifles and things started coming in. Bows are actually quite dangerous still, in those days you didn't have the kind of compound reflex bows that we do have today, so they were much, much harder to pull. You had to be pretty beefy to pull a longbow. I've tried to pull a longbow, and I am not physically strong enough to pull a longbow. I can pull a reflex bow just fine, but a longbow. I don't. You have to build up to that over several years to pull a longbow properly, because you need very, very strong back muscles to pull a longbow properly. They're really, really quite vicious things, and you need a lot of physical strength. Okay, now I've not trained from my youth to be a longbowman, so I'm incapable of pulling a longbow. I just am not strong enough to do it. That's a thing. Your people using bows need to have been using bows all the way through their lives, because otherwise they won't be very good at shooting them. And it takes practice. You can't just decide to be an excellent archer. Like you can't decide to be good at anything else. So you have to decide what your characters are going to be for. If they're going to be excellent at archery, they need to have trained. That's what they do. Okay, the other thing is the inexhaustible supply of arrows trick. That's always a problem. One of the problems you had with archery is you would run out of ammo. You literally would run out of ammunition quite fast, because you shoot an arrow, it's gone. You don't get it back. It doesn't recharge. So your quiver can carry maybe 20 arrows, and at that point you're, particularly if you're nowhere near anywhere where you can get some arrows back, your bow then becomes quite useless, because you haven't got anything to fire with it. So you need to, so bowmen in organised armies would take turns shooting, and then would have stashes of arrows made ready to be kind of reloaded behind them, which would be quite well guarded. So all those little aspects of warfare, you can't just rock up and go, everyone's got 20 arrows, off you go, because they'll run out of arrows in the first few minutes of the battle, and then you'll be in trouble because you can't shoot back. A Commander O'Connor, there you go. So they do severely affect you, because you're pulling a massive tension, and you can see why people were, like I say, I think it was deformed. And it was a young person's game. Jason's quite right, because you need to be strong and fit to physically do that. And it's the same with swords, actually. I don't know if any of you have actually handled a long sword. Now I've done some, through my martial arts, I've done a fair bit of weapons training with staffs and various types of swords. And mostly I've studied the katana, which of course isn't a European blade at all, it's a Japanese one. But swords are interesting, actually, because all this swinging and hacking stuff that you see, most films where they basically whack at each other's shields until one of them falls down, that's isn't how you fight, because it's plainly obvious that if you whack somebody's shield, that's not going to be all that effective. So there's a lot more sort of thrusting and trying to stab people rather than kind of hacking at them, because actually a longsword is a hugely difficult weapon to actually use, because it's simply so heavy. If you've ever had a chance to pick up a longsword, a proper two-handed kind of broadsword type thing, it's astonishingly unwieldy. It really is astonishingly unwieldy. I was amazed the first time I picked one up. To try and attempt to swing with such a sword, I was not sturdy enough to do it. It'd take me completely off balance. It was a weapon totally unsuitable to somebody of my stature and weight. It would be of no use to me whatsoever. I'd be much better off with a foil or an épée or something like that, but I could just impale somebody. That would work much better, because that sword would be useless in parrying anything. So actually swords and the ability to use one and against different types of opponent was interesting, because of course you have sword on sword where you're parrying with somebody, where you have to have an equally agile weapon, and compared to a broadsword, which was mostly designed for pummeling your opponent into the ground. Should he be slow enough not to be able to dodge it? Because depending on, this came to a head actually in quite a lot of European battles, is depending on the technology you had, some people would be armed with big heavy swords. The problem with a broadsword was if you get hit by a broadsword and you don't have any armour on, then you're probably dead, because it's going to just either decapitate you or do some very, very serious damage to your internals. But if you manage to avoid the thrust of the broadsword or the swing of the broadsword, and you have a much lighter weapon, you can jump in, do some damage, jump back out again before the guy with the broadsword has managed to get back onto another stroke. So it depends on which kind of battle you find yourself in as to what sort of weapon was actually good. Broadswords were no good in close quarters combat, because you simply couldn't use them. You couldn't swing them around. There'd be somebody too close to you who'd get caught. So again, depending on the combat, different types of swords and different types of weapons were much more usable. So I do have a crappy replica of the Conan sword that weighs about 2 to 2.5 kilograms. And that's, Glenn saying, the Romans with their short swords, much better in close quarters to have a sword that's only like about 1.5 to 2 feet long. Claymores, that's a Scottish one. I don't know so much about the claymores, actually. Is that because the katanas that I've trained with are edged weapons, but only along one side, so they're a slashing weapon, which is basically designed to disembowel you as fast as possible. A very skilled warrior with a katana will not basically try and stab you to death. They'll basically just try and disembowel you. So it's a slashing weapon, which is designed to undercut chest armor and go for your vitals. So you basically collapse to your knees with your vitals hanging out. Despite any armor that you might be wearing, the katana is actually a very surgical weapon. And then you've got all the tactics with, like I said, the Romans fighting and an organised army that has discipline, that knows how to defend each individual person within the army as a kind of moving as a whole. Very, very powerful. So I think I must admit the average claymore is about 140 centimeters long, 33 centimeter grip. Okay. 107 centimeter blade and weight of approximately 5 pounds. Okay, so 2.5. So again, quite a big weapon to kind of to wield. And the other thing that I always find quite funny about fantasy novels is that they have blades where they are incredibly finely wrought. They have all this filigree and stuff woven into them, which is truly nice. I really like that sort of stuff. Not the sort of weapons you find on the battlefield. Those things are almost always sort of ceremonial weapons that are given to people to say, well done, you've fought a good battle, here's a sword that you can't actually use in battle because it will break. You actually want a completely different type of forged weapon for actually whacking somebody else. And a proper sword, and this is why so few actual battle swords have survived. Most of the ones that we have are ceremonial ones, because the ones that were used in battle get notched really, really quickly and become almost unusable within a few battles because they get weakened by the fact that you keep whacking them on things, and they become notched, and you can resharpen them a number of times, but after a while you simply just end up with metal fatigue and they break. So it also depends on the quality of the forging, because they didn't have modern steel for many cases. So all those sort of problems. So and I love the fantasy decorations and the fact that they stamp the names, and the whole story in Lord of the Rings of Anduril, Flame of the West, being reforged from the shards of Narsil. Lovely fantasy sort of story, but not a weapon that in the real world Aragorn would have been able to take into battle and actually used. It would be far better as an heirloom of his house, somewhere safe where it wasn't going to get damaged. But of course, in fantasy, you can imbue the weapons with magical powers, and whether that's a magical power that makes them, makes the bearer of the weapon much stronger or much faster, or means the sword is effectively invulnerable to damage in some sort of way, or an elvish blade which glows in the dark when the orcs are near, or an elvish blade that can cut through things far more effectively than a normal weapon. All those sort of things are good fantasy. Things that you can do with weapons. But it's I think a good idea to have an understanding of how the weapons started out and what you use them for. So my big pet hates for me are inexhaustible arrows. People firing things really quick. I mean, a longbowman could probably fire an arrow every 30 to 40 seconds. That's how long it would take to fire is the wrong word, loose, and that's a really bad thing. I have once been guilty of myself, and I did catch myself, is that you didn't fire a bow. Okay, so you occasionally see fantasy films where they line up all the archers, and then they point them at the badges and go fire. Of course, that's not what they said, because that's you don't fire a bow. You loose a bow. They would say loose. Is the word that they would use. So there's a few fantasy novels kicking about and a few fantasy films where they say fire when they've got bows drawn, which is just wrong. Okay, that's a really bad mistake. So you fire a gun because guns contain gunpowder which needs to be fired. But depending on the type of bow, you can fire faster, but bows don't fire as fast as some fantasy authors seem to think they do. Because simply because the amount of stress involved in pulling these things. And the same things with crossbows. Okay, so a crossbow is a very deadly weapon. Actually, I've fired crossbows. Crossbows are very, very cool. But in order to reload a crossbow, you have to wind back the mechanism. That is, even if you're doing this with the ratcheting thing, you have to put a lot of power into that. You're winding up an awful lot of tension. It's really quite tiring. I did it once. Again, that was enough for me. I would be useless in the battle because I'm a bit tired now. Can we stop and have a rest after the first 5 minutes? Assuming I wasn't already dead, I'd be useless in a battle. It's like, I've been lugging this sword about, I've swung it a few times, and now my arms are aching. I can't pull back that longbow, and that crossbow, I've wound it back once, and I'm tired now. I can have a sit down. So I would definitely be useless. But all of these things are very, very physically demanding. Okay, so like Jace said earlier, you have to. It's a job for the young. Once you get to our age or my age, you're definitely past it. You're in the guy at the back with the strategy hat on. Hopefully, if you're still alive. Pole axes and halberds need more love. Yeah, now halberds are nasty. Okay, now that's a proper weapon. Okay, so a halberd is like a pole. Okay, if you don't know what a halberd is, look it up. It's one of the nastiest and I think most effective weapons actually in medieval warfare. The Scots seem to be particularly fond of them actually. You see a lot of halberds in Scotland, and it basically is a big pole. It's quite long. It's probably about 8 foot long, and it has a pointy blade on the top of it, but also like an axe kind of cutting edge to it as well. And you could do multiple things with a halberd. You could swing it around and cause mayhem, but that's not what it was most effective for. The best way that you would use it is if you had a whole bunch of people charging at you on horses. What you would do as a foot soldier, and the orcs tried this actually on the attack at Minas Tirith when the Rohirrim charged down the hill, is you jam the pole in the ground at an angle and you hold on to it. So the pointy end is facing up, and then you'd use it to basically, as the horses are charging towards you, you basically stab the horses in the chest as they come barreling towards you. That's what halberds were particularly nasty weapons in that kind of conflict. So, halberds, definitely need to use them more in fantasy novels. They're an excellent, a very, very effective weapon. Sort of spear with nasty axes and pikes on them. They were very unpleasant weapons, but very effective. If you were infantry dealing with an attacking bunch of knights on horseback, halberd was your friend in those particular examples. There's a special cocking handle that made them approach a lot easier, but it's still a pain. Yeah, so reloading your weapon is is still problematic. A good thing people in that time only lived to the ripe old age of 30. So life expectancy wasn't great in medieval times in general, and I think if you were in the army, it was probably even shorter. Nobody lived to our or my sort of age in those years at all. So an axe is quite an interesting weapon in warfare. I don't know whether axes were all. You tend to associate obviously dwarves with axes. That's just the thing, isn't it? My axe. I don't know much about the use of axes in warfare. How effective they were, because an axe versus a sword, unless you actually manage to bludgeon somebody with your axe. I suppose the Vikings, that makes sense. Vikings use them a lot, so that's quite interesting. But if somebody with an axe comes up against somebody with a sword at a similar level of skill, I'd generally put my money on the person with the sword. Axes were used very effectively, but they're a very small thing. So fantasy axes are so bad, so large. The problem with a fantasy axe is, like you say, you swing that massive weight around. If you miss, you're just exposed, aren't you? I suppose that's a good thing, Lucky Luigi. Swords are very expensive, unlike spears. Around. Now that's a good point, actually. So the economics of weaponry may come in there. So maybe swords are more exclusive in the sense they cost more costly to make. That's a good point. The economics of the warfare. If you're going to equip a big army, you're going to equip whatever they've got to hand. So that's why a lot of peasants ended up in battle with just spades and things, didn't they? Because that's all they had. Also used late. Hello, Drew. No problem at all, sir. The Viking axes were hand axes, not the huge fancy ones. So war axes and two-handed axes. So I don't know whether a two-handed axe is all that effective or not in battle. Be interesting. And a spear usually. So a spear can be very effective. And I suppose in the heat of a pitched battle, you would just grab whatever you could, trying to bludgeon the person next to you to death as much as possible. Axes are not very useful as defensive. So that's the beauty of a sword. You can use it for defense as well. It can block an attack, but you can throw an axe. So maybe it swings and roundabouts in there. I suppose you can throw a sword. Probably not a good idea if that's your only weapon, but all those sort of things. So I think that's the sort of thing is we tend to have this fantasy novels. Battles are things that are, and oddly enough, it's changed more recently, I suppose, because we've got a bit more used to some blood and guts and gore, whereas years and years ago, battles tend to be very clean and tidy. The armies would charge together. There'd be a lot of hacking and swinging swords, and then somebody would have won. Whereas nowadays, the films tend to be a little bit more realistic in the sense it's actually a bloody gory mess in the midst of an army like that, which is obviously going to be a little bit closer to reality. A very, very unpleasant environment to find yourself in. Even I think if you were a skilled warrior, there's no way in the midst of a melee where you could necessarily keep yourself defended from all angles all of the time. So I still get the impression that surviving a pitched sort of melee battle was very much a matter of luck as well as skill. I mean, that's obviously if you've got an opponent in front of you, you need to have the skill to defend him. But if you're attacking the guy at the front and there's another guy sneaking up behind you, suddenly just going to stab you in the back, then very, very tricky. I don't know. I certainly would not like to be in a pitched medieval battle. That sounds like a very, 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 very unpleasant place to be. Sorry, Drew, you need to be a lot more research on the longbow. 1 arrow every 6 seconds for your first. Was it really? Okay, I thought it was much slower than that. Okay, that's interesting. I shall go and have a look at that. So in that case, 1 arrow every 6 seconds. That's very impressive. I couldn't. I certainly couldn't do anything close to that. It's worth. But in that case, I'll take another look at that. But it's worth doing a bit of research into what the weapons can and can't do. And things like horses, what they can and can't do, so that you can kind of inform your fantasy novel a little bit more, believably. Now, I'm not saying that you should make your fantasy novel into a hard sci-fi novel. That's obviously going a bit too far. But things like that are a detail that is useful to kind of help ground the reader into the battle a little bit. Sometimes sprinkle a bit of detail into it, and sometimes the different types of weapons. It's quite nice to maybe make the weapons a bit more specific to different characters within the thing. If you've got somebody, and Lord of the Rings does that quite well. Again, you get Gimli's obviously got a fondness for axes. Legolas is the bowman, and Aragorn likes his sword. Those are distinguishing features for the different things. I think that's quite nice. Just googled a meteor hammer. It looks like a type of flail. So flails, and what's the Morning Star? A few other people have mentioned. Those are sort of things that crop up in fantasy stories, and you see them quite a lot. I mean, is the Morning Star the ball with the spikes on the end of a chain? Because that one, I don't know again how practical that is to actually use. It looks pretty scary. Whether or not it would actually be all that effective, I don't know. I mean, it'd be interesting to try out some of these weapons. Morning Star is a type of mace. Okay, so. Those sort of things. So I don't know. So they're interesting. Different types of weapons. Maces. So a mace is basically that's your bludgeoning sort of weapon, isn't it? You do lots of I suppose blunt edge trauma damage to your opponent, or break bones. That's what those weapons are designed to do, aren't they? The ones on the chain are flails, and they weren't really used. Okay, there we go. So balls with, maces with spikes on. So that's not very nice to get whacked by one of those. And then of course you've got armour as well. We haven't really talked about that this evening, but armour as a result of trying to defend yourself against all these nasty weapons. Blunt weapons are very effective against armour. So yes, you see, because you can still get concussed even if your armour isn't penetrated. It's the same sort of thing that you have modern days with bulletproof vests. Whereas yes, a bulletproof vest can stop the bullet actually entering your body, but the actual impact force of the bullet is still getting absorbed by your body to a degree, because that force has got to go somewhere. So all of those sort of issues. Flails are rubbish in war. That's interesting. So used more as a form to punish slaves. Yeah, they look very intimidating, whether they're actually practical or not. So I accidentally whacked myself with one as well. So that's good. All those sort of things are all sorts of fun. But so warfare in fantasy novels, I always think is an interesting thing to observe. So and it's something that I've kind of had my eye on. Is writing Lords of Midnight and Doom Dark Revenge, I've tried to introduce elements of strategy and tactics into it rather than just have big armies charging each other, because A, that's a little bit boring, and B, that's not really how real battles work. Real battles can be turned because of the weather, or because of the terrain, or how well the army was prepared, or how tired they were. All of those sort of things are elements in military victories which are worth considering. So there we go. I hope you've found it interesting talking about how to decapitate everybody and all those sort of things. One thing I would really like to know, the old sort of slightly overused trope in some places of the of the kind of chosen warrior of each army, basically saying rather than let's sacrifice all of our army, let's just have a chosen warrior from each side have a fight, and then whoever wins that will accept that as winning the battle. That's sounds like quite an honourable thing. Whether that actually occurs very often in real life, I'm not sure. Warfare in fantasy novels is just that, fantasy. Best fantasy books I read concerning warfare with the Wheel of Time is very good. Yes, I good. JR1988, chuck your question in at the end. We'll deal with that as we close out the stream. Something else that needs more love in fantasy is nuclear weapons. Yeah. The only problem with nuclear weapons in fantasy is that they're kind of a one-shot problem. In comes the nuke, and boom. Yeah, so ask away, JL1988. So all the sorts of problems. Yeah, so I mean, it is fantasy, and we need to bear that in mind. It's just it gets a little bit, I suppose. I find when you get. I mean, I need to speed up my archery. Clearly, I've got that one wrong. But you need to don't make weapons do things that they can't do. Don't have some tactics and strategy in your story. Right, JL1988's question. He's been very patient with this. He's waited an hour and a half, so we need to do them. I come loaded with a writing question. My companion novella is done. Oh well, congratulations. All self-edits and beta reads completed. Should I bother to pay out for a pro edit or just publish it as it is? The trouble is that editing is really, really expensive. It is. You're quite right. And I'm already paying out quite a bit for the full-length novel. It's a difficult question to answer. Now, I've read your story, haven't I? So and it wasn't in bad shape when I read it, and that was a while back. So obviously if it's improved since then. An editor will always make things better if they're a good editor. Finding a good editor is obviously part of that quest. But a good editor will improve a story. Now, it's a difficult question to answer, because if an editor is going to make the difference between your story going, everyone's going to go, yeah, it's utterly fantastic, compared to actually the story isn't all that great because it needs editing. It depends on a sort of objective assessment of the quality of your manuscript at that point, which is a very hard thing to do because it's a very subjective thing. Depends how confident you feel in your ability to have edited it yourself. I suppose that's the answer. Now having had 8 or so of my books edited by a professional editor, personally, I'm still not in the place where I could be comfortable going, I've got this editing lark sorted, I can do it myself now. I'm not good enough myself to do that. I know that. An editor will always improve my stuff quite noticeably. But you've got to place that against, like you say, editors are expensive. So, is it worth having an editor on this book or not? It will definitely make it better. Is it worth the cost compared to the amount of books that you expect to sell? That's more an economic problem than it is a quality problem. So it depends what you're trying to emphasize. If you're trying to make your book the best it can possibly be, then yes, get an editor. If the economics of doing that don't make sense, then maybe not. So it's a difficult one to answer definitively, I'm afraid, GR 1988. I think that the thing is you can publish it and see what the response is, or maybe you can widen your pool of readers. The only thing I would say there is if you've got a bunch of readers who are themselves writers, those are the best type of readers, if that makes sense, because they're going to be able to give you more constructive feedback about what is good and what isn't good about your book, whereas general readers probably won't pick up on some of the editing issues that you otherwise would see. So hopefully that gives you something to think about. There isn't a definitive answer. Pillbox UK, David Gemmell's. Yeah, David Gemmell's stuff is good. Dark Prince, an amazing book. It was fantasy based in Greek mythology. Yes, that stuff is definitely worth reading. So writing versus wordsmithing. So yeah, it's difficult. I aspire to being able to do without an editor, but I'm not there yet. You need somebody who can look at the story with a kind of... Editors are funny people, actually, because they're able to read a story without getting involved in it. Because they're looking for structure and looking for tempo and looking for pace and looking for characterization, consistency, and they're looking for dialogue that isn't going anywhere and looking for pacing and looking for POV scene changes, all those sort of things. So all those things are difficult to gauge. What was the most annoying spelling mistake you found in the published printed book? I must admit, I'm quite forgiving on spelling mistakes in books. I don't tend to notice them. I think people say, "Oh, that's got a spelling mistake," and I go, "I didn't spot that." I'm a very bad proofreader. I'm not very good at proofreading things, so I don't tend to notice them. All those sort of things. Books you get. I always wanted to write a book, but I can't even speak properly half the time. Excellent. So the more, basically, JR98, the more eyes you can have on your book before it goes out the door, the better. But there isn't a definitive answer to your question, alas. So hopefully that gives you an idea. But there we go. Anyway, my friends, thank you very much for your company. I hope you found a dissection of fantasy battles interesting. So and we'll be back for more. There will be a small break upcoming. I generally take the week of Easter off, so I'll let you know which stream's going to be cancelled. But about 3 weeks' time, I think Easter is, so there'll be a bit of a gap in the schedule then. But other than that, we're good. So stay tuned to that. And we will at some point towards the end of October, not October. At the end of April, we'll be doing a little retrospective on the book that we published last year on this stream, which was the 9 Streams of Consciousness. So that's something that I've promised that we should do as well. Go back and have a look at that. And I need to sort out royalty payments for those excellent authors who did some sterling work last year. We will not be able to retire, I'm afraid. Although it would be nice, we have sold a few copies, so some monies have to be made. So there we go. That's going to be good. But anyway, yes, fare thee well. Thank you very much for that. Wolf's wet paws. All kind of good stuff. Thank you. And so we chat about science fiction and fantasy stuff. It's all light-hearted conversation on Monday evenings, and that's what we do. So if you're interested in writing or just generally critiquing or having fun talking about fantasy and science fiction, this is the stream for you. And we waffle on about all that kind of good stuff. So it's great fun. Anyway, so there'll be more Elite Dangerous, of course, on Thursday. The retro stream is kicking off again with Frontier First Encounters on Saturday, and then we'll roll around with that. But like I said, there will be a bit of a gap around Easter because, I'm entitled to take a holiday. apparently. So I've decided that's what I'm going to do. So anyway, fantastic stuff. Anyway, guys, thank you very much, and I will see you on. Have yourself a fantastic rest of the week. Look after yourselves and be good, okay? And if you do get involved in a medieval battle, stay away from the halberds is my advice. Take care, my friends, and I will see you soon. Bye-bye now.